program is going to be about the crisis in and around Ukraine. And I'm going to say that, of course, this is an important crisis in itself, but it's very interesting that it is increasingly becoming the crisis around which all other issues, or all other big issues in the world, are increasingly being framed. So, to give just one example, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria recently had a trip to the United Arab Emirates, where he was received as an honoured guest by the government there. Now, the United Arab Emirates, along with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, was one of the Arab states, Gulf Arab states, which sponsored the resistance to President Assad and which sought his overthrow. Well, now he is being received in the UAE as a guest, and it's highly likely that before very long he will also be received in other Gulf monarchies as well, conceivably even in the biggest, which is Saudi Arabia. To my mind, the fact that Assad is being received in the Gulf monarchies in this fashion is a further indicator that the Gulf monarchies have become increasingly disillusioned with many aspects of their relationship with the United States and with the Western powers, and for that reason they're seeking to mend their fences with the Russians, with Assad, perhaps conceivably in time even with the Iranians, as they seek to bolster their own security positions. And it seems that the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who visited the Gulf in an attempt to try to get the Gulf producers to increase oil production, that he came away finding that the meeting had been completely fruitless. I should say that there's not been much coverage of this visit by Boris Johnson to the Gulf in the British media. So much so, in fact, that I'm not even entirely certain whether this visit has happened at all. But anyway, I did see a report that it had been fruitless, so presumably it has happened and it's been a failure. In addition, we see that other things around the world are also shaping around the Ukrainian crisis. So the Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Kishida, who is an ally of the United States, went to India to visit, to meet with the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. And of course, Japan and India are both members of the Quad, this curious arrangement that the United States has tried to create in the Indo-Pacific region, bringing together the United States, Australia, Japan, and India in a kind of loose grouping and arrangement which everybody knows is supposed to be targeted against China. So the visit by the Prime Minister of Japan to India is a visit of one Quad member to another. And Mr. Kishida, the Japanese Prime Minister, apparently came with a request that the Indian government condemn the Russian offensive in Ukraine, and apparently he came with a sweetener, a promise of $42 billion of Japanese investment in the Indian economy. And very interestingly, the Indians apparently politely said no. The statement, the joint statement that was finally published, contains no condemnation of the Russians. So in that respect, and from that perspective, it seems that this visit by Mr. Kishida, probably or presumably in part prompted by the United States, it might have been an already planned visit, but clearly its agenda, the Japanese agenda, was adjusted to deal with the Ukraine crisis. Well, this visit appears to have produced no significant result at all, and must, on the part of the United States, be chalked up as a disappointment. So we see how lots of things that happen now in international relations are being framed by the overall crisis in Ukraine. But what is actually happening in Ukraine at the moment? Well, it's not been a particularly informative day in terms of what we learn about the actual fighting in Ukraine. But there was a report coming from the Donetsk People's Republic that their forces, that the Russian-backed forces, now control half of the city of Mariupol. Now, I'm not quite sure what half means. Does it mean the outskirts of the city or the centre? Or does it mean half of the central part of the city? From what I can glean, it probably means half the central part of the city. The same report from the Donetsk People's Republic said that the forces, the Ukrainian forces which are resisting in Mariupol, have been reduced by around half, from 14,000 to presumably 7,000. Well, of course, I can't confirm any of these reports, but I do suspect that the claim that the DPR forces now control half the city is probably true. Anyway, that's Mariupol. Further north, it seems that the incremental encirclement of the Ukrainian forces opposite Donetsk is continuing. And of course, further north around Severodonetsk, the Ukrainian forces there are already encircled. And there's been a report, which, by the way, I would consider to be extremely unreliable. It's basically appeared on Twitter, but there is a claims on Twitter that the Ukrainian command in Donbass, specifically, it seems the Ukrainian forces that are now threatened by incremental encirclement, which are positioned opposite the city of Donetsk, that the command of those forces actually asked Kiev for permission to withdraw, to retreat out of Donbass, because their position is becoming increasingly untenable. Now, I want to stress again that I have no way of corroborating this information. Allegedly and supposedly, this request to withdraw from Donbass was refused. Now, was refused by the government in Kiev. Now, one must be extremely careful here. When one gets reports like this, it's entirely possible that this is a Russian plant, but who knows, it might also be true. It might explain, if it is true, certain statements that Zelensky also made late last night. He finally, and for the first time, appeared to give ground on the question of Ukraine's territorial integrity, as he puts it, which is the sticking point in the negotiations. He appeared to accept the possibility that Ukraine might lose Crimea, which of course has been under Russian control since 2014, but also Donbass. He did try to hedge it with conditions. He said that the status of these territories would only be the subject of negotiation once there'd been a ceasefire and Russia had completely pulled out its forces from Ukraine, and Ukraine had already been given security guarantees. All claims or all conditions which, of course, the Russians are going to reject, or in fact have already rejected, and which would be completely unacceptable to the Russians. And Zelensky has also said that the decision as to the status of these republics, these territories, should be determined by a referendum, and indeed any final agreement between Russia and Ukraine should be subject to an all-Ukraine referendum also. All of this, the Russians have said, is unacceptable to them. They have rejected, in particular, proposals for an all-Ukrainian referendum, which would, of course, give the Ukrainians a good opportunity to simply go back on whatever they'd agreed in the negotiations. But the fact remains that Zelensky has, for the first time, appeared to leave open the possibility that the future status of Crimea and of Donbass might be a valid subject of negotiation. If the situation on the ground in Donbass, in Mariupol, is as critical as all the information I'm getting suggests. And if it is indeed the case that the Ukrainian command in Donbass has actually requested permission to retreat, well, that might explain why Zelensky is moving. But at the moment, as I said, the conditions he's attaching are unacceptable to the Russians, and I suspect that, well, they've already in fact made that clear. Now, I would just, before I finish my roundup of military affairs, just mention one other rather curious fact. I read Western coverage of the war, even though I give little credence to most of what is written. But there was one little thing that was mentioned, which I found really fascinating, and which shows how ill-informed in some respects the US is about what is actually going on in Donbass. It turns out that the United States, the US intelligence community, has not been able to identify the Russian general who is in overall command of the Russian forces in Ukraine. There's even some speculation that there is in fact no such person. Can I say that there is undoubtedly such a person, and it is regular Russian practice, going all the way back to the Afghan war of the 1980s, to withhold the name of the officer commanding from Russian media publications. This is very much, by the way, in the style of the old German general staff, which used to say that a general staff officer, and all Russian commanders are general staff officers, that a general staff officer should be nameless. But it is curious that the United States doesn't even know, that even the United States doesn't know who this person is. And that suggests to me that Russian communications, internal communications, are secure, that the United States has not been able to break the codes or work out exactly what the Russians are saying to each other as the Kremlin and the Defense Ministry in Moscow communicate with their forces in Ukraine. So the US will have a great deal of intelligence, an awful lot of information about the fighting in Ukraine. It can obtain it from satellites, from human agents on the ground, from all kinds of other means. But it seems that the Russian military's very highest grade communications are for the moment secure, and that the United States has not been able to penetrate them, since it seems that they haven't even been able to identify who the overall general in command of the Russian forces on the ground actually is, and haven't apparently been able to clarify the full picture of the Russian chain of command in Ukraine. Something which I find interesting and actually remarkable, and which does give an insight into the limitations of US intelligence gathering. Now, that seems to me, as far as I can say, an account of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. I have little source of information that I can use to corroborate these things. Our friend and Gonzalo Lira is doing an amazing job providing information from Kharkiv, but obviously there's lots of things that are going on the ground all over Ukraine, this enormous country, which is very, very difficult to verify. There have also been reports, for example, that unidentified aircraft from Ukraine have been crossing into Hungarian and NATO airspace, causing NATO aircraft to scramble to intercept them. It's unclear whose aircraft this is. For the record, I think it's more likely that they're Ukrainian than Russian in this theatre of the war. So far as I can see, Russian attacks on facilities in Western Ukraine have been carried out by long-range missiles, not by aircraft. So I'm guessing that these are Ukrainian aircraft, but I can't be sure. Maybe they are doing what the North Koreans and I believe the North Vietnamese did in their respective wars. Maybe these are Ukrainian jets or aircraft which slip into NATO airspace to avoid being intercepted by the Russian Air Force. I'm guessing here. I don't know. But anyway, it's an unnerving thing, and it perhaps shows that the war is perhaps closer to people in Europe than they would like to think. I'd also say that there's been a rather concerning statement by President Biden, who has floated the possibility of the Russians using biological or chemical weapons in Ukraine. This isn't the first time that's happened, and I have to say that that does concern me. And of course, Gonzalo Lira and others have floated the possibility of provocations, of the possibility that things could be staged in Ukraine to justify further action. I hope that doesn't happen, but I do think the possibility is there, and it might even be high. In the meantime, on the other side of the fence, it's becoming increasingly clear that Russian financial markets are showing a great deal more resiliency than the Western powers expected. The Russian central bank and the Russian authorities started to reopen Russian financial markets on Monday, and there were some gyrations. The ruble briefly softened, but overall things have been reasonably stable. And for example, there's been apparently high demands for Russian debt, OFZs, and we read from Interfax that prices for most federal loan bonds or OFZs are rising during the main trading session on the Moscow Exchange for the second straight day by 1 to 5%. And yields on long-term fixed rate OFC PD issues fell 13% in price by the middle of trading, and yields on short-term bonds were down 15 to 17%, well below the central bank's key rate of 20%. Now, it should be said that it might be that this is partly because the Russian central bank is buying OFZs. There's been some reports that the central bank has said that it's willing to buy OFZs in order to support them. But in fact, from the Interfax report, it does look as if this is actual trading, though trading on the thin side. And it also says that the positive trend persisted during the afternoon trading on Tuesday. Market participants are generally upbeat about the market's prospects, in the expectation that the central bank's key rate will not remain at 20% per annum for long, and that it will come down in an upside for OFCs, especially the long segment. Now, what that means is that at some point it's going to be more profitable for people to buy OFZs because the yield on OFZs will be higher than if they just keep their money in the bank, where they, at the moment, because of the central bank's key rate being at 20%, they would get high interest on any money they pay in the bank. It's not entirely easy to make full sense of all of this, but it does suggest a stabilizing financial situation within Russia, which is consistent with everything else that we are hearing about the overall state of the economy. By the way, the fact that the yields on OFZs are down to 15 to 17% on short-term bonds may be an indicator of where the Russian market expects inflation to go in Russia this year, that it could be expecting it to trade the final figure to be somewhere along that sort of margin, 15 to 17%, which is high, but it's certainly not hyperinflation or anything like that. And bear in mind, all of this is happening against a backdrop of higher inflation, probably double-digit inflation pretty much everywhere else. Now, so much for the international situation, so much for the situation in Ukraine itself. And as I said, we've just seen this pattern of developments within the Russian financial system. What about the situation in the West? Well, it seems, first of all, that there's been a bitter argument within the European Union about whether to stop oil purchases from Russia. Several countries, Germany at the forefront, apparently rejected this idea. Now, the Germans, of course, rejected all sorts of things before. They said at one time that they would not agree to Russia being disconnected from the SWIFT payment mechanism. Some Russian banks were disconnected from the SWIFT interbank payment system. So perhaps this German position won't hold for very long. But that seems to be the German position at the moment. And I have to say that President Biden's comments about a possible biochemical attack by the Russians in Ukraine might be intended to pave the ground eventually for a German decision, to a pressure on Germany to agree to stop oil price purchases from Russia, which would be an extremely bad thing. It would only result in oil prices rising even further and, of course, even higher inflation in the West. But there we go. But perhaps most alarming of all and most concerning has been US policy towards China. Now, I ought to say quickly that over the last few days, since the Biden-Xi summit meeting on Friday, the virtual summit meeting on Friday, the Chinese media has been hardening in its stance over the Ukraine issue, clearly blaming Ukraine for what has happened, and clearly blaming, the United States for what has happened in Ukraine, and making it clear that China will not support the US campaign against Russia and will certainly not sanction it. Now, I take these articles from Global Times. I'm only going to read the headlines, by the way. I'm not going to go into the articles themselves. The headlines, I think, give a pretty full idea of what the articles themselves say. And I would say again that though Global Times is, of course, only one newspaper, it is one that is especially close to the Chinese leadership and which also, it seems to me, clearly reflects the Chinese government's opinions and official positions. So these are just some of the headlines from Global Times, from articles on Global Times. So there's been an article on the 20th of March by somebody called Xin Ping, US hegemony, the culprit of Ukraine crisis. Then there's another article which is from GT, Global Times staff reporters, Unholy Crusade, White House leads on anti-Russian propaganda, Western rights groups turn blind eye to hate speech. And then there's an editorial in Global Times, which is US is re-establishing a new inquisition using Russia-Ukraine crisis as excuse. And just to make it clear, who are the targets of this inquisition, the editorial comes with a cartoon which shows Uncle Sam in a leaking boat with the Europeans pointing an accusing finger at the Russian bear and the Chinese panda. So the Chinese panda and the Russian bear are on firm ground. The Uncle Sam and his European allies are in a leaking boat. But they're obviously, that's, as I said, Uncle Sam pointing the finger at the Russian bear and the Chinese panda as part of this inquisition. And then another article, a slightly earlier article from March 18th. This is another editorial. China-Russia relations, the most important strategic asset that cannot be damaged by US provocation. So all this is from Global Times, and this is just a selection of the kind of articles that the Chinese media are publishing. Anyway, so the Chinese have been hardening their position on the Ukrainian conflict. They're making it increasingly clear that any US attempt to create difficulties between them and Russia is not going to go anywhere. Well, something has now happened which reinforces the fears, the concerns I have already had following the Biden-Xi meeting on Friday, the virtual meeting on Friday. When I discussed that meeting, I said that the texts, the readouts of the meeting, published both by the Chinese and the US side, read to me remarkably like the readouts of US-Russian talks in the lead up to this crisis over Ukraine. They all of those readouts, the US-Russian readouts, seem to suggest constructive discussions, understanding on the part of the US of Russian concerns, agreements to move forward. And in fact, it was clear that nothing did in fact happen, that there was no real understanding, no mutual understanding, and in fact it all ended in a crash, and in fact in the war in Ukraine, which we now have. And I have to say that this latest readout between Biden and Xi Jinping reads to me exactly like that. And in particular, there is this extremely disturbing section in the Chinese readout, which I'm going to quote in full. It's a long readout, but I'm just going to focus on these particular sections. President Xi, this is from the Chinese readout, President Xi stressed that he and President Biden shared the view that China and the US need to respect each other's coexist in peace and avoid confrontation, and that the two sides should increase communication and dialogue at all levels and in all fields. President Biden has just reiterated that the US does not seek to have a new Cold War with China, to change China's system, or to revise alliances against China, and that the US does not support Taiwan independence or intend to seek a conflict with China. I take these remarks very seriously, said President Xi. President Xi pointed out the China-US relationship, instead of getting out of the predicament created by the previous US administration, has encountered a growing number of challenges. What's worth noting in particular is that some people in the US have sent a wrong signal to Taiwan independence forces. This is very dangerous. Mishandling of the Taiwan question will have a disruptive impact on the bilateral ties. China hopes that the United States will give due attention to this issue. The direct cause for the current situation in the China-US relationship is that some people on the US side have not followed through on the important common understanding reached by the two presidents and have not acted on President Biden's positive statements. The US has misperceived and miscalculated China's strategic intention. Now, that is as straightforward a statement of concern about US bad faith as one is ever likely to see in a readout like this. What Xi is telling Biden is, Biden, you're coming here, you're saying all these things, you say that you want peace, you want to avoid confrontation, you want to increase communication and dialogue, you don't want a new Cold War, you don't want to change our political system, you're not seeking to revitalize alliances against China, and you do not support Taiwanese independence. I take all your remarks very seriously, but as soon as you go away, your officials immediately do the opposite, with the result that you're telling me one thing, the US is doing something completely different, and instead of our relations improving, as you say they want them to improve, instead they're simply getting worse. And here we are, just a few days, 4 days from that meeting, and we now have confirmation that the United States is sanctioning China officials. And we have this extraordinary inflammatory statement from US Secretary of State Blinken. Perpetrators of human rights abuses must continue to face consequences. The United States has taken action to impose visa restrictions on People's Republic of China officials for attempting to intimidate, harass and repress dissidents and human rights defenders inside and outside of China. Now, that is in effect a kind of sanction. It is a straightforward act against Chinese officials. The US hasn't yet said who these officials are, and we go on to read in Bloomberg that Biden has called on China to end its ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, repressive policies in Tibet, crackdown on fundamental freedoms in Hong Kong, and human rights violations. The United States rejects efforts by Chinese officials to harass, intimidate, survey, and abduct members of ethnic and religious minority groups, including those who seek safety abroad, and US citizens who speak out on behalf of these vulnerable populations. We are committed to defending human rights around the world and will continue to use all diplomatic and economic measures to promote accountability. So, the Chinese inevitably are going to see this action as US interference in their internal affairs, because the territories that Blinken has mentioned are, of course, territories that the Chinese consider to be a part of the People's Republic of China. And, of course, the Chinese consistently reject any attempt to interfere in their internal affairs. So they will see this as a blatant attempt by the United States to interfere in their internal affairs. But they will also see this as further proof of the point that Xi Jinping made to Biden over the course of that virtual summit meeting on Friday. The United States comes along and tells the Chinese, through the US President Joe Biden himself, that the United States wants good relations with China and doesn't want to change China's political system, revitalize alliances against China, take steps that are hostile to China. And then, exactly as Xi Jinping said, no sooner does the president say that than within days, US officials, including Blinken, do all the steps that shows that Biden's words to Xi Jinping, or his words of reassurance, are so much empty air. The United States gives itself the right to interfere in Chinese internal affairs, claiming that it is doing so in order to protect human rights. It is prepared to impose sanctions on Chinese officials, unnamed officials. It calls them perpetrators, though of course it goes without saying that they've not been actually identified or convicted in any court of actually doing anything. But most important of all, it says, or Biden says, we are committing to defending human rights around the world and will continue to use all diplomatic and economic measures to promote accountability. Economic measures. In other words, sanctions against the Chinese economy, against Chinese businesses, against Chinese exports, against the Chinese economy. It's a clear signal, and the Chinese are certain to read it in that way, that economic sanctions by the United States against China are coming. I've been reading reports, again, I can't confirm this, that the Chinese authorities have been publishing warnings, sending warnings to all their various economic, all their various business people, that a sanctions war on the part of the United States against China is coming. It will not initially be about Ukraine, it will be about Chinese internal policies. But as we've seen with sanctions against Russia, once those sanctions start being imposed, they escalate until there is eventually a total breakdown in economic relations to the extent that that is possible. And I would say that sanctions against Russia have been disruptive enough. They are the reason why we're going to see inflation in the Western economies rise to well into double figures over the next few weeks and months. And if the economic sanctions against China now start to be unrolled, as I firmly predict, then the economic disruption is going to get orders of magnitude worse. The Chinese economy being, of course, absolutely pivotal to the world economy to a degree that Russia's is not. So an extraordinarily disturbing step taken by the United States government, and it reinforces the sense that decisions in Washington are being driven by a group of ideologues in the State Department, the National Security Council, the think tank community, parts of the media, and within the intelligence agencies, and that they have little real concern for the broader disruptions that they're